December 13, 1945. Hameln prison in the British-occupied zone of northern Germany. At 3 minutes past 10 in the morning, a 22-year-old woman walks into an execution chamber. She has just stepped on the weighing scale and answered the assistant executioner's question. When asked her age, she pauses, smiles, and gives the figure as 21. The British hangman Albert Pierrepoint later recorded in his autobiography that she walked toward him laughing. She was the youngest woman ever hanged under British law in the 20th century, and she had become the second highest-ranking female overseer at the Auschwitz-Birkenau extermination camp before she turned 21 years old. I'm going to walk you through the file on Irma Grese, the Belsen guard, the Auschwitz overseer, the woman the prosecution called the Beast. We will look at where she came from, what she did inside the camps, what witnesses said under oath at the Belsen Trial, and exactly how her execution was carried out at Hameln prison according to the documented account of the man who hanged her. If you want more files like this on the perpetrator's history tries to forget, hit subscribe right now. It costs you nothing, and it tells the algorithm to bring this content to more researchers like you. Let us begin with the origin. Irma Ilse Ida Grese was born on October 7, 1923 in the village of Rechen in the Mecklenburg region of northern Germany. Her father, Alfred Grese, was a dairy worker. Her mother, Berta, took her own life in 1936 by drinking hydrochloric acid after discovering her husband's affair with the daughter of a local pub owner. Irma was 12 years old at the time. She was the third of 5 children. The village was small, the family was poor, and the political tide rising in Germany was about to sweep an entire generation of rural girls into something none of them could have understood at that age. Irma left school in 1938 at the age of 15. She was described by teachers as a poor student and by her own sister Helene's later sworn trial testimony as a girl who avoided physical confrontation as a child. She tried multiple jobs over the following years: a failed dairy apprenticeship, work as a shop assistant, 2 years as an assisted nurse at an SS sanatorium. She wanted to become a qualified nurse. The hospital rejected her application on the grounds of insufficient academic background. By 1937 or 1938, she had joined the League of German Girls, the female branch of the Hitler Youth, against her father's wishes. Her father, Alfred, had himself joined the Nazi Party in 1937 and would later serve as an Ortsgruppenleiter in the local party structure. But according to Helene's testimony at the Belsen Trial defense proceedings, he disapproved of his daughter's enthusiasm for the SS uniform, and the two repeatedly argued about her concentration camp service. In 1943, when Irma returned home in uniform on leave, the argument turned physical. In 1942, at the age of 18, she was assigned to the Ravensbrück Concentration Camp as a trainee guard. The SS female auxiliary was technically a civilian employer arrangement. The women were not formally SS members in the legal sense, but they wore the uniform, drew the salary, and answered to SS command. In March 1943, Irma Grese was transferred to Auschwitz-Birkenau. She was 19 years old. Pause on that. 19. At Birkenau, she was first assigned to Camp B as a telephone operator in a block leader's office. After a documented disciplinary violation, she was moved to oversee a punishment detail. According to the trial testimony of Capel Helena Copper, Grese ran that detail for 7 months and was responsible for the deaths of at least 30 prisoners per day in that role. By December 1943, she was made male censor for the women's camp. In May 1944, she was promoted to Oberaufseherin, senior supervisor, and given authority over Camp C, which held approximately 30,000 Jewish women from Poland and Hungary. She was 20 years old. Witnesses at her trial described her routine in detail. She carried a whip. She kept a pistol on her belt. Survivor Olga Lenyola, a Hungarian Jewish doctor who later wrote the memoir 5 Chimneys, recorded that Lenyo could often identify Grese in the camp by her perfume before seeing her, an unusual signal of cleanliness in a place defined by filth and disease. Lengyel also documented that Grese selected favored prisoners as personal servants, used them until she lost interest, and then sent them to the gas chambers during the next ramp selection. Dr. Gisela Perl, a Hungarian gynecologist forced to work as a camp doctor, testified to a more specific and clinical pattern. Perl was repeatedly ordered to operate on prisoners whose breasts had been cut open by the wire-ended whip and had become infected with lice and dirt. She had no anesthetic. She used an unsterilized knife, and Grese, According to Pearl's documented memoir, I was a doctor in Auschwitz, attended these operations personally, and showed visible enjoyment of the procedures. Pearl recorded that Grace would kick the prisoner being operated on if her screams interfered with Grace's reaction. This is the documented pattern: beating, selection, and an enjoyment of suffering recorded by trained medical witnesses under oath. Witnesses at the Belsen trial used the same word repeatedly to describe her demeanor during these acts: calm. In January 1945, as the Red Army advanced from the east, Auschwitz was evacuated. Grace was transferred briefly back to Ravensbrück, then to Bergen-Belsen in early March 1945. Belsen was not, in technical terms, a death camp. It had no gas chambers. But by the spring of 1945, it had become something arguably worse: a holding pen where prisoners died of typhus, dysentery, and starvation, at a rate the SS administration had stopped attempting to control. When British forces of the 11th Armored Division entered Belsen on April 15, 1945, they found around 60,000 surviving prisoners and approximately 13,000 unburied bodies on the ground. Irma Grese was 21 years old. She did not flee. She remained at the camp during the British arrival, alongside the camp commandant Josef Mengele and other senior SS staff. Photographs taken by British Army cameramen show her in custody, standing among other captured guards. She is recognizable in the surviving liberation footage. If you want the full uncensored archive footage of the Belsen liberation referenced in this file, the link is in the description below. Watching the original material is the only way to understand the scale of what investigators walked into. The Belsen trial opened on September 17, 1945, at a converted gymnasium in Lüneburg. It was conducted by a British military court under the Royal Warrant of June 1945, which authorized the trial of war criminals for offenses committed against Allied nationals. 45 defendants were charged. Irma Grese was defendant number 9. The indictment against her covered 2 counts: war crimes at Bergen-Belsen and war crimes at Auschwitz. The prosecution called multiple survivor witnesses against her by name: Polish survivor Ilona Stein, who testified she had seen Grese strike prisoners with a rubber truncheon at Belsen; Edith Trieger; Daniel Safran, who testified under oath that 2 weeks before the liberation of Belsen, he had seen Grese beating a young woman in the camp with a riding crop while a pistol hung from her belt. Ada Bimco, later known as Hadassah Rosensaft, gave evidence about her violence at both camps. Grese took the stand in her own defense. She admitted to carrying a whip. She admitted to beating prisoners on what she called duty grounds. She denied involvement in the gas chamber selections at Birkenau. She claimed she had only followed orders from her superior, Maria Mundel. The court rejected the superior orders defense under the royal warrant procedure. Her demeanor on the stand was documented in court records as cold and dismissive. She objected to repeated questioning with terse answers about her duties. She showed no visible emotion until her younger sister Helene testified as a character witness, recalling the violent confrontation between Irma and their father in 1943. Only then did Grese break down sobbing in court. On November 17, 1945, the verdict was delivered: guilty on both counts. Sentence: death by hanging. She was 22 years and 41 days old. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, in his capacity as Commander-in-Chief of the British Army of the Rhine, reviewed and confirmed the death sentences personally. Her death warrant was dated December 7, 1945, and signed by Montgomery. On the following day, she and the other 10 condemned defendants were transferred from Lüneburg prison to Hameln prison in Westphalia. Elisabeth Volkenrath and Wanna Bormann, the 2 other women sentenced to death, chose not to lodge appeals. The British Army's Royal Engineers constructed a double-trap gallows and a converted execution chamber at the end of a cell corridor inside Hameln prison. Albert Pierrepoint, the chief executioner for the United Kingdom, was flown over by Royal Air Force transport. Pierrepoint was a professional. He had executed condemned prisoners in Britain since 1932. The British military authorities chose him specifically because they wanted the procedure to be quick, accurate, and impossible to portray as a botched act of revenge. Pierrepoint arrived at Hameln and inspected the execution chamber on the day before the executions. Brigadier Paton Walsh was the British officer in charge of the proceedings. Miss Wilson, the Deputy Governor of Strangeways Prison in Manchester, was present to oversee the hangings of the 3 women. The trap mechanism was tested in advance. On the morning of December 13, 1945, the women were executed individually. the men afterward in pairs to speed the process. According to the original timed and signed death warrant records, Elizabeth Volkenrath was hanged first at 9:34 am. Irma Grese followed second at 10:03 am. Juana Bormann was hanged last at 10:38 am. The 8 men of the Belsen Trial group, along with 2 other condemned war criminals unconnected to the trial, were hanged in pairs across the rest of the day. Pierrepoint's published account in his autobiography Executioner records the procedure with Grese in unusual detail. The condemned were waiting in a row of small cells along the corridor leading to the execution chamber. After the male defendants had been weighed and measured the evening before, Pierrepoint's assistant, Regimental Sergeant Major O'Neill, called for Irma Grese to step out. According to Pierrepoint's account, she came out of her cell laughing. She answered the routine identification questions. When asked her age, she paused, smiled, and gave it as 21, which the officers knew to be correct from her records. O'Neill asked her to step onto the scales for the weight measurement that would determine her drop length. Grese stepped on and spoke a single word, "Schnell," quickly. The next morning, the officers climbed the stairs to the cells. Pierrepoint walked into the corridor and called her name. The German guards closed the inspection grills on the other cells and opened her door. The cell itself was too small for Pierrepoint to enter, so he pinioned her arms behind her in the corridor. He said, "Follow me," in English. O'Neill repeated the instruction in German. According to Pierrepoint's own published account, Grese walked into the execution chamber at 9:34 am. By his recollection, though the death warrant timing recorded 10,033, she looked briefly at the officials standing around the trap and walked to the center where Pierrepoint had marked a chalk position. She stood on the mark firmly. Pierrepoint placed the white cotton cap over her head. As he did so, and what Pierrepoint described in his autobiography as a languid voice, she spoke a final word, "Schnell." Pierrepoint pulled the lever. The trap door opened. The medical officer present descended into the pit and certified death. The cause of death was recorded as dislocation of the cervical vertebrae. After 20 minutes, the body was taken down and placed in the coffin, ready for burial. The other 2 women followed in sequence. Volkenrath was 26 years old. Bormann was 52. On the order of the British presiding judge, who specifically wished to prevent any of the executed from becoming objects of pilgrimage or political martyrdom in post-war Germany, the bodies were buried in unmarked graves in the courtyard of Hameln prison. The British military authorities released no photographs of the executions to the press. A short written statement was issued by Montgomery's office confirming that the sentences had been carried out. In 1954, the remains of all those hanged at Hameln were reinterred at the Amwell Cemetery near the prison. The complete transcript of the Belsen trial was published by the United Nations War Crimes Commission in 1947 as Volume 2 of the Law Reports of Trials of War Criminals. The Belsen trial transcripts run to dozens of volumes of evidence and survivor testimony and remain available to researchers through the National Archives at Kew and through the Holocaust Education and Archive Research Team's digitized excerpts. She was 22 years old when she was hanged. She had spent more than 15% of her short life inside the concentration camp system, first as a trainee, then as a senior overseer responsible for the deaths of thousands of women in Camp C at Birkenau, and finally as one of the captured guards photographed by British Army cameramen at Belsen in April 1945. If you found this file useful, the most concrete thing you can do is hit subscribe and share it with one other person who studies this period. Every subscription tells a platform that documented perpetrator history matters, and it keeps this archive growing. The file on Irma Grese is closed.